Welcome back to Country Cow Designs. In this video I'll show you how to make our new pattern, the Yasmota handbag. So this bag isn't for the faint of heart. You're going to want to have some bag making experience before you attempt this one. This is my attempt at like a fancy bag, so it didn't turn out that fancy, but it's our first like proper handbag for a while. So on the outside you've just got a slip pocket, which you could add any type of magnetic snap to. This one's got a rivet back magnetic snap, and on the other side it's just nice and plain. You've got a zip top closure, and inside you've got a large slip pocket and 3 card slots and also a pen holder. There's also a zip pocket, and the whole bag is turned out through the zip pocket, which I know you're kind of worried about already because of using vinyl and things like that. But don't worry, I've made 2 of these with vinyl and they both turn out really easily because the pocket is so wide. So this one was made on my domestic Bernina sewing machine. So depending on the materials you're using, you can do it on a domestic machine. This one was made on my new machine, which we are using for the tutorial today. So today's tutorial is being made on my Janome HD9. This is the second time I've ever made a bag on it, so bear with me. We might have some tension issues as I, work out how to get comfortable with this machine. I've also got an example in vinyl, which was made on Adam's industrial sewing machine while my sewing machine was out of action. And another one that's just made out of canvas. So you can use all types of materials in this bag, and the stabilizers that you use, you'll just need to adjust them. The pattern says, what stabilizers to use if you're using a thicker material. If you want to do your handles with something like leather, thick leather like this, and you don't want it in the seams, all you have to do is cut your handles 3.5 inches shorter than the pattern says. And then you're going to have them coming out away from the seam so that, you don't have to sew through that extra bulk. For today's tutorial, I am using a vinyl from Blended Threads, which is part of a strike sew, which means they send me the fabric for free and I get to make something with it to help them with their promotion. So I will link in the description all of the materials that I use for this video. Let me know if you have any questions, and please give the video a thumbs up if you like it. So let's get started. For this tutorial, I am going to be using this vinyl for the exterior of the bag. So this is a vinyl from Blended Threads. It's pretty nice, not too thick. So I've cut out all of my exterior pieces using that. Because I'm using vinyl for the exterior, I'm using Decaville Light for my stabilizer. If you're using cotton or canvas, then I recommend that you stick with the ultra firm stabilizer that's recommended in the pattern for your main panels. However, whichever you're using, vinyl or cotton or canvas, I definitely recommend sticking with ultra firm stabilizer for the gusset. This will give your bag a really nice shape and make sure that your base isn't too floppy. Next, I've got my 2 pieces of piping cord for my handles, my number 5 zip tape ready to be cut down for the various zips. Then I've got my crossbody strap, which is just some webbing, and brushed copper hardware. For the exterior slip pocket, I'm going to show you how to attach a feature magnetic snap if you want to add one. For the lining, I'm using this polka dot pink and white cotton fabric. I've interfaced all my cotton fabric with a medium weight woven interfacing, which you'll need to do for any pieces that you're using cotton for. And lastly, for my feature fabric on the exterior, I'm using this teal faux leather. For step 1, we're going to make the straps and the handles. So you should have your 2 handle pieces cut out of your accent fabric, your crossbody strap, 2 pieces of piping cord, 2 swivel hooks and a strap slider. Start with your handles. Now we're going to flip them over so we're looking at the wrong side, and you need to draw a line down the center of each handle. So you can see I've already done that on mine. Next, I'm going to apply some double-sided tape down the long edges. Once that double-sided tape is applied, just peel off the cover and we're going to fold the long edges into the center line. When you're folding this second side in, you want to leave like just the tiniest gap between the 2 sides. This will reduce the bulk on that edge. Now you need to fold that again on that center line and clip it in place. Once you're all clipped into place, you need to find the center and then mark 4.5 inches to the right and 4.5 inches to the left. So hopefully you can see there that I've got my lines marked, and this is a 9-inch gap. What we're going to do is we're going to put the 9-inch piping cord into that gap. Now it's time to sew the handle. There's a lot of fussy stitching on these handles, so I recommend using a matching thread colour if you have it, although I'm going to use a contrasting thread colour for this tutorial so you can see it nice and clearly. The first thing we're going to do is sew up this long open edge with a generous 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, so a little bit more than an 1/8. We're going to go all the way up to the top. Then we are going to come back down this folded edge until we reach the first 9-inch mark. Then we're going to go across and use a scant 1/8 of an inch along here, come back across the next 9-inch mark and use a generous 1/8 of an inch the rest of the way. So I'll go through that as we're sewing it. For this step, I'm using a Microtex size 90 needle. I'm using a Microtex needle because I'm using vinyl, but also because of the double-sided tape, because it stops it from sticking to the needle. So when you reach the end of that open edge, you want to come across and then continue using a generous 1/8 of an inch seam allowance up this folded edge. When you reach your first mark, sew across it and then sew with a scant 1/8 of an inch seam allowance along that open edge. When you reach the second mark, come back across and use a generous 1/8 of an inch seam allowance again. Repeat that process so you've got 2 identical handles. Now you can see this one of mine is twisting a little bit. It's not too much of a problem. We're going to sew this in place later, so I'm not worried about it. So set your handles aside and grab your crossbody strap. For these raw edges, I'm going to use a tiny piece of vinyl on each edge. So what I'm going to do is just wrap that around, and then I'm going to stitch this open edge here to hold it in place. I'll also use a little bit of fabric glue to hold that in place. So I'm going to take this end and I'm going to wrap it over the middle bar of this strap slider. And you want it to come back on itself by 1 inch or 2 inches. Now I'm going to fit a rivet right through my strap end and a rivet up here close to this middle bar. Once your rivets are set, grab the other end of your strap and you want to put a swivel hook on and then feed it back over that center bar. So that's what it should look like on this end. And on the opposite end, we just want to wrap this now around the remaining swivel hook and clip that in place. Once again, I'm going to fit a rivet just up here next to the swivel hook and one through my strap end, and then I will fix those in place. That's your quick and simple crossbody strap all done. If you want to make a crossbody strap out of fabric, I'll link a video now for an alternative way to do that. But now we're ready to move on to the next step. Step 2 is the lining zip pocket. For this step, you're going to need a zip pocket overlay or a zip pocket facing, your zip, 2 pocket pieces and one of your main lining panels. So the first thing I've done is I've marked this. I've measured down 2¼ inches and I've marked it ready for the pocket. Now I'm going to grab one of my pocket pieces, going to place my zip right side up on top, so everything's right side up and the zip is closing to the left. And I'm going to sew that in place on that top edge using a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now that's sewn, place the second pocket piece right side up, and then we're going to take this open end of the zip and place that right side up, and we're going to sew that with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now that's sewn, I'm going to open that up, and the right side of your zip should be on the wrong side of the fabric. And I'm just going to roll this out. So you could just press this on an iron. I'm just going to roll it so I don't have to get my iron out. But we're just trying to get the zip to lay nice and flat. And this will make it easier to fit. Set that aside for a moment and grab your main panel and your facing. Now I'm going to use some double-sided tape on this, and I'm going to try and keep the tape close to the outside edge, and you'll find out why in a minute. So go ahead and stick that in place, making sure it's centered, which will be easier if you've marked the center on your facing. Now we need to sew the outside edge. Now I'm sewing this lightweight cotton with fewer layers. I've changed my needle down to a size 80 universal. So for this step, we are using this vinyl facing. If you don't have any vinyl or cork or a raw edge fabric of some kind, that is absolutely fine. The pattern includes instructions for making the zip pocket using cotton. So you just need to follow the separate instructions for that. So what we're going to do now is cut the fabric out from behind this facing. And this is the reason that I put the sellotape on the outside, because we need to trim it back a bit, and wherever the tape is, it's going to be stuck down. So this is going to make it slightly easier to trim. Now all I'm doing is trimming this back so that we won't be able to see it behind the facing. Okay, so it doesn't need to be neat on the back because no one's ever going to see that. We're just looking at the front. So now that's done, what I need to do is put the pocket behind it. Now the flatter your pocket zip is sitting, the easier this is going to be. I'm going to use a little bit of double-sided tape. You could use fabric glue if you prefer. Okay, so I'm going to remove the top first, and what we want to do is place this centered over the zip. So take your time with this, making sure that you get it straight and even on both sides. Then I'm going to remove this bottom piece so I can stick that in place. Okay, once that's stuck in place, make sure your pocket pieces are laying open. So this one's coming down, that one's going up. We're going to sew the inside of this box. Okay, so that's sewn in place. Not my best sewing. This faux leather is quite slippery, and I'm still trying to get used to the new machine. So there you go. So I'm going to flip that over, and I'm going to pull the top pocket piece down. Now you can see that one of them is shorter. So the longer one, I'm going to fold it up to the wrong side. So what I want to do is I want to fold them both up, but I want the shorter piece to only be folded up by, say, 1/4 inch like that. So just take that over to the iron and press that to keep it in place. Once that's pressed, we just need to sew the sides. So I'll just put a few clips along here. So what we're going to do is we're going to sew the sides of the pockets together like this. And we're going to leave the bottom open for now. Make sure you backstitch really well on the bottom edges because we're going to be turning the whole bag out through here later. So we'll move on to the next step. Step 3 is the lining slip pocket. For this step, you're going to need a magnetic snap, your lining slip pocket piece, and your remaining lining main panel. So we'll start with this lining slip pocket piece, and what we need to do is mark it 1 inch in from each of the short edges. Now I'm going to fold these short edges up to the line on each edge and press that in place. Next, I'm going to mark it 3 3/4 inches and 6 3/4 inches up from this folded edge, and this is the bottom edge. Now I'm going to fold it wrong sides together on the first line. Then fold it right sides together on that second line, and it should now look like this. So flip it over to the right side. You've got some more marks to make. So this is going to be for the card slots that are on the front of the pocket. We're marking it 3 inches in, 5 1/2 and 8. And you're measuring all of those from the right hand side. So these 3 are going to be card slots, and this one's going to be a pen holder. What we're going to do is take this over to the sewing machine and sew up this line, then just across one tiny stitch, and then come back down, and you want to be about a needle's width from the first line. So it's going to be really close together, these 2 lines. So you're going to go up, across, back down on all 3 lines. Now that's sewn, grab the top and bring it down so it's right sides together. Line up those top and bottom edges and clip together. Now we're going to sew the sides, but make sure that you leave the bottom unsewn for now. So turn that out through the gap in the bottom. A lot of people like to trim the corners before they turn this out, but I actually find that I get a need to finish if I leave them intact. So I'm going to do that. And I've got this turning tool that I'm going to use to poke the corners out. Give it a press with your iron to get it looking nice and neat. And then we're going to top stitch this top edge. Now flip that over. Measure 3/4 inch down and mark that ready for your magnetic snap. Then you can place the washer over the mark and mark the side slits. And then we're just going to cut those side slits. If you have some, you can also add a little bit of fray check to those slits just to make sure they don't fray in the future. And then you can fit the male part of your magnetic snap. So I'm going to push it through the slits, and then I've also got a piece of stabilizer, just a scrap piece that I've cut, and I'm going to put that on the back just for a little bit of added strength. Then I'm going to put the prongs on, the washer, and then fold your prongs back. Next you want to grab your main panel, and I'm just going to crease it to mark the center. And then we want to fit the corresponding magnetic snap 3 1/4 inches down on the center. Once the snap is fitted on the main panel, you just want to connect those together and then make sure that this is completely straight. Once you're happy that it's straight, what I like to do, we're gonna sew down the side and then across the bottom and up, and that's how we're going to close the bottom of the pocket. But I like to hold my pocket in place by clipping around the edges like this, and then I just sort of pull it away and unclip it as I go, but that helps keep everything in place as I'm sewing it. And that's your slip pocket finished. Let's move on to the next step. Step 4 is the zip top closure. For this step, you're going to need 2 lining top zip closure pieces, 2 exteriors, your zip and your zip end. So we'll start with the zip. Find the end where the zip will be when it's closed. So mine's closing that way. And you just want to mark it 1 inch in and mark it on both sides. Now open the zip up on that end, and what you want to do is you kind of want to pinch the zip on the mark. So you're going to like pinch it together, and it will create this right angle that then, if you just hold that fold there, the zip will be going at a right angle. So you can see my mark is still right there. What I'm going to do is just sew 2 stitches through there to hold that in place. Now we need to do the same thing on the other side, so just pinch it on the mark and it will create that nice 90-degree angle. Make sure that it matches the other side. And I like to sew these in place just with a couple of stitches by hand, purely because it's difficult to hold it in place on the machine whilst you're doing it. Now we just need to trim off the excess so the zip is the same width all the way down. And now I have a raw edge, so because I'm using nylon zip tape, I'm just going to lightly melt the edge there to stop it from fraying. Now I'm going to add my zip end. So in the pattern there's quick instructions if you want to do like a leather or vinyl end instead, but I'm going to use this hardware one. So for each side I fold it in once and then I fold it in again, so that the end is nice and tight like that. Now you can put a bit of glue into your zip end first if you want to, just to make it extra secure. And then just slide it on. To help me screw it in, I use an awl, and I just make a nice firm hole through there. This will make it easier for my screw to go in. So set your zip aside for a moment, and on all 4 of these pieces, on the wrong side, we want to mark it 1/2 inch in. So on every piece from the short end, you're just marking it 1/2 inch in from the edge. Now we need to fold these short edges in. So for the vinyl, I'm going to use a little bit of double-sided tape. If you're using cotton, you can just do this with an iron. So you're just folding it up to the line that you marked. Do that on both ends and do it with all 4 pieces. Once those are all folded, you just want to grab one of your exterior pieces and just place it right side up. Open up your zip all the way so that you can just work with one side. And what we're going to do is place the zip right sides together with it. But we want these teeth, where the teeth are turned, to line up with this, where the fabric is folded into. So hopefully you can see that. They're not overlapping. And just clip that in place. And then clip that along the rest of that edge, just lining it up nice and neat. And baste that in place. While we're sewing these next few steps, make sure that all of your stitches stay within the top closure piece. So you don't want to be sewing further along your zip because that will be on show later on. So with this exterior piece still facing up, we're going to grab one of the lining pieces and place it right sides together with the exterior. Match up these edges nice and neat and clip in place. Okay, and you're going to sew this together as close as you feel comfortable. You could use a 1/4 inch or a 3/8 of an inch. It really won't make a difference to anything. We're just going to sew it from this end to this end. Make sure that your stitches stay on the pieces of fabric and don't go off the edges. So now we want to push these fabrics away from the zip. Just give that a nice little press. And clip those together. Now that's clipped together, we're going to sew all of this. We're going to top stitch it with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance on all 4 edges. Now we're going to grab the remaining exterior piece, and we want to place it right sides together with the other side of the zip. Again, you want to make sure that your teeth on the zip are lined up with the double fold of fabric there so that they're not overlapping. And baste that in place. Grab your last lining piece and you're going to put that right sides together with the exterior piece again. Make sure they're lined up neatly on the ends. You can always refold them if they're not lining up, and sew those together. As we did with the other side, we're going to press these fabrics back, clip them together, and then we'll top stitch all 4 edges. And that is your zip top closure finished. Step 5 is the lining assembly. For this step, you're going to need your 2 top trim pieces, which should be made out of your exterior fabric, your lining gusset, your 2 lining gusset tops, your 2 main lining panels, which have already got the pockets assembled, and the zip top closure. So the first thing you need to do is mark the centers on the top and bottom of all of your pieces. Once all of your centers are marked, we just want to start with the slip pocket panel and the zip pocket overlay. So I'm just going to match the centers on the top edge and clip them together and baste those together. Grab one of your top trim pieces and just flip it so it's right sides together with that. Match up your center marks and clip together. And we're going to sew that with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. So push that top trim up. So all the seams are going to be behind the top trim. And just give that a good press. Now we're going to top stitch the top trim with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. So you'll have a little bit of overhang just here, and you just want to trim this down so that it's got a nice neat edge. Now grab your other lining panel, place that right side up, and place this other edge of the zip top closure right sides together with that. So this is right side up, the main panel's right side up, and you just want to clip those together. Make sure your centers are matched and baste that in place. Now grab your remaining top trim piece and you're going to do the same thing. Place it right sides together like that, and then we're going to sew it with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. So same again, I'm going to push that up, press the seam, and then we're going to top stitch the top trim. So just trim off the little excess bits that you have on the edges there. And then set that aside for a moment. Grab your lining gusset and your lining gusset tops, and what we're going to do is place one right sides together on each end. So we're just going to match up these short ends and clip them together. Do the same on this end of the gusset and sew those on with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. For both of these you want to push this up and we want to top stitch the exterior piece. So make sure that the seams are behind the exterior piece and then just top stitch that with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Do the same thing on this one. So we're now ready to fit the gusset. Now what we're going to do is maybe just tuck the zip out of the way because you don't want to kind of sew through that by accident. So I'll just try and clip it like that. Now what I'm going to do is attach it to this back panel first. And I'm going to start by matching up the center mark on the gusset to the bottom center mark of the panel. Then I'm going to match the top part up and clip that together. And then I'm going to snip into this gusset just by about 1/4 of an inch. No more than that really. And we're just doing it where the gusset's going to be fitting to a curve. This will allow the gusset to kind of fit around this curve, so you can just spread it out. These slits will kind of spread a little bit around the curve. So that's all clipped in place. I'm just going to open that zip so I can kind of keep that out of the way. Now up here, initially it doesn't look like it's going to match because you want this top trim here to match the lining gusset top. But you can see now that I've clipped it with like a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, it does match. So these should line up once it's sewn, but when you're clipping it together, it's not going to look like it's going to match. So we're going to sew this with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance at the top, but after about 1 inch, we're going to come in to a 1/2 inch seam allowance and increase it. I'm going to use a generous 1/2 of an inch seam allowance around this bottom section. So somewhere between a 1/2 inch and a 5/8 of an inch. 5/8 of an inch is going to be too big, 1/2 an inch is going to be too small. So we're just going to go somewhere in between the two. So that's quite a big seam allowance, so you could do this later, but I'm going to do it right now. I'm just going to trim it down. I'm not going to trim that top 1 inch though, but I'm just going to reduce the size of it. If you've got them, you could use pinking shears on this, and because it's a curve, it might help your lining to sit even neater. Okay, so we need to attach the other side. So we're going to match the center bottom mark with the center bottom mark on the gusset and clip together. Next, you're going to match up the top and clip that together on both sides. And as we did with the other side, we're just going to snip into the gusset where it's going to sit on the curves. Once that's clipped, we're going to sew that with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance at the top, then changing to a 1/2 inch seam allowance after the first inch or so, and then change back so you're at 3/8 of an inch again at the top here. So again, I'm going to trim the seam allowance down on this side because it's a pretty big seam allowance and we just don't want to have all of that bulk inside the bag. So one last thing that we're going to do on this step, we're going to press the seam allowance open at the top, and we're just going to baste across to here so that it stays sewn open, because it's going to make top stitching the bag a lot easier. So I'm going to do this for all 4 seams at the top of the bag. So that's your lining done. Set that aside and we'll move on to the exterior. Step 6 is the exterior main panels. For this step, you're going to need your 2 ready-made handles, your lining and exterior slip pocket pieces, your 2 exterior main panels, and the 2 stabilizers to go with those. So the first thing I'm going to do, because my stabilizer is fusible, I'm just going to fuse it centrally on the back of each of these pieces. If your stabilizer isn't fusible, you can simply use some double-sided tape or fabric glue to attach it, because later on it will be stitched in place. When you're fusing to vinyl or cork, always test on an offcut first, because you can ruin your fabric if it's got the wrong heat or the wrong steam or something like that on it. So just set those main panels aside for a minute, and we're going to start with the slip pocket. What we're going to do is we're going to place the exterior and lining pieces right sides together, and we'll sew the top and bottom edge with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now that's sewn, we're going to turn it right sides out through one of these sides. And just spend a bit of time sort of rolling these seams out and pressing them. So from the inside, you can press the seam open to get a neat finish. So flatten out those seams so that you've got a nice crisp finish. I'm going to clip this top edge to try and keep it neat. And we need to top stitch this edge here, the short edge, which is the top of the pocket. But we're also going to close these side gaps at the same time. So I've just remembered that I wanted to fit one of these magnets to the top of this slip pocket. And to do that, I'm going to have to put some stabilizer in this top edge. So ideally, if you're doing this, you want to put the stabilizer in before you top stitch it. But you can always do it later if you forget, like I am now. So I'm just going to slip that between the layers and make sure that it's centered on the top edge. Okay, so I've also marked the center position on this slip pocket piece. I'm going to take the big part of the magnet, I'm going to place that over that mark so it's centered. Now you can use a bit of glue if you like on the back to hold that in place, but I'm actually just going to go ahead and screw mine straight in. Okay, so now that's screwed, I'm going to grab my main panel. And I want this to be about 3 inches down from the top. So you need to make sure this is nice and centered. And you can do that by measuring the distance in from here. So that's 1 3/4 inches, and then I'll check that is the same over here. It needs to go slightly to the right, there we go. Okay, once I'm happy with where my pocket is, I'm going to use a little bit of double-sided tape to just tape the bottom edge of these sides down. So I'm also going to grab a few clips and just fold this up and clip these bottom edges in place, just so that I don't like lose where my pocket is. This should all regain its shape afterwards, so it shouldn't be a problem. Now I want to mark where the other part of my magnetic snap is going to be, so I'm going to push down hard on this. And what it should do is leave a nice little indentation where the other part of my magnetic snap needs to go. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do next, is go ahead and fit this. So you can place your washer on top of the mark and mark the side slits. You can then push this female part of the magnetic snap through the slits. Pop the washer through on the other side and push your prongs back. So once that's clipped in place, you can see it snapped itself into place. Just check that your pocket is still straight. And then we're going to baste these sides and we're going to top stitch this bottom edge, which is why we didn't do it earlier. You may notice I've changed to a Teflon presser foot. That's just because I was experiencing a bit of resistance with this vinyl. Once that slip pocket is in place, we need to fit the handle. So I recommend getting pattern piece A. What I do is I just chop a little bit out of this strap placement. This makes it slightly easier to locate where the straps are going to be, because then I can place this piece over and I can just mark the top and bottom where the strap's going to be. So grab one of your handles, and we're going to want this neat folded edge facing out when the bag's being used. So just bear that in mind when you're using your straps. You don't want this seam on the outside. You want it like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to clip it in place. It's probably easiest to use some double-sided tape. What we want is for this bottom edge here to line up right there with the main panel. And then your mark where your stitching is should roughly be in line with this top edge. So use a little bit of double-sided tape to stick that in place. You don't want your double-sided tape going all the way up to that stitch line, just a good portion of it. And then stick that in place, lining up all your marks and making sure that this raw edge of the slip pocket is hidden. Now you need to mark this handle 9 inches up from the bottom. So line up your 9 inches with the bottom of that handle and then just draw a line across here. Make sure you're using an erasable fabric pen. Now what we're going to do is sew it in place with a scant 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. We're going to go up one side, across that line and back down. Now this is where it's important that you have used a generous 1/8 of an inch in the last step, because otherwise you would have just been sewing over the same stitches again and it won't look as neat. Okay, so you can see why we recommend a matching thread colour, because there's some really fussy stitching on this and you're going to just make your life easier if you have a matching thread colour. So I'm just going to peel the protective film off this magnet. There we go. And I'm going to bring this handle around. So we're going to do the same thing on this side. I'm going to mark it 9 inches up and then stick it down in place. So again, make sure it's covering this raw edge of your slip pocket, and I'm going to sew with a scant 1/8 of an inch seam allowance up to the 9 inch mark I've made, across and back down. Now that handle is sewn in place, we just need to do the same with the other panel. Okay, and then we're going to sew this with a scant 1/8 of an inch seam allowance up, across and down on both sides of the handle. Step 7 is the exterior gusset. For this step, you're going to need your gusset stabilizer, your exterior gusset piece, your base overlay, 2 strap tabs, 2 gusset accents, and the 2 gusset top pieces. You'll also need some bag feet if you're going to use them. So the first thing we'll do is grab this base overlay. Now you can see that I've already marked the centers on mine, and then I've marked where I want my bag feet to go. For vinyl like this, I use one of these silver vinyl pens. They're really handy for showing up on dark colors. So flip that over, draw a line 1 inch in from each short edge. Then we're going to use some double-sided tape to fold the edges into the line. Now I'll take this over to the machine and top stitch each of these edges with a generous 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. So we're doing the same seam allowances that we did on the handles so that the whole bag matches. Once that's top stitched, just set that aside for a moment. Now you need to mark the centers on your gusset stabilizer and the main gusset piece. So flip your exterior gusset over, and what we want to do is place this centrally. So you need to mark up your centers, match up your center marks, and it should be inset by 1/2 an inch on these long edges. This is going to be longer than your exterior base, don't worry about that. You can either fuse this in place or use some double-sided tape, it's up to you. Once that is stuck in place, turn that over, and you need to place your base overlay over the top, and again match up the center marks on these two pieces. So we're going to top stitch this with a scant 1/8 of an inch seam allowance on each of these short edges, and also just baste it in place. So just watch out, because this isn't quite the same width up here as you're basting it. You can trim this first if you feel that it's easier. Once that's sewn on, you can trim the little bits of the base overlay so that it matches. If you're having bag feet, now's the time to fit them so that you can fit them through all the layers, including the stabilizer. This will add a little bit of extra strength for them. Now grab your 2 strap tab pieces, and on the wrong side, just draw a line down the long center. And then I'm going to use some double-sided tape to hold the long edges in place. If you're using cotton, you can just press this with an iron. Now we're going to top stitch the long edges with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once your strap tabs are top stitched, you want to wrap them around a D-ring. Make sure that the raw edge is on the inside, and just bring those bottom edges to meet each other. Then we're going to baste along this bottom edge. Now grab your exterior gusset top, and for each of these, what you want to do is place this D-ring on top, but you want this strap tab to be hanging off the edge by about 1/4 of an inch, and make sure it's centered on here, and then just clip in place. And we're just going to baste that in place. Do the same with the other one. Once those are basted in place, grab your gusset accents and place one right sides together with that bottom edge. We're going to sew that in place with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Using a hump jumper will help you get over this hump without actually skipping any stitches. Once both of those are done, you can push this gusset accent down away from the rest, and then what we're going to do is top stitch this seam here. But to match the handles, we're going to use a generous 1/8 of an inch seam allowance and then a scant 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. At this point, you might be thinking that you want to put a rivet through. Just hold off until we've fitted it to the rest of the bag, because that way it will go through the stabilizer and have added strength. So grab the rest of your gusset, and what we're going to do is place the gusset accent right sides together with this top edge. And when you sew this in place, you're going to sew through the stabilizer as well. So we're going to use 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and we'll do both sides at the same time. So you're going to push that up, and we're going to top stitch here. Again, we're going to use a scant and a generous 1/8 of an inch seam allowance so that everything matches. When you're top stitching this, you're going through everything, including the stabilizer again. So that is your gusset almost done. Now, if you want to fit a rivet through here, now would be a good time to do so. If you place it just below this stitching here, you should be able to go through the strap tabs and also through the stabilizer. The last thing we need to do on this is to trim this stabilizer to match. So you want to make sure that it's going to be 1/2 inch below this. So this doesn't have to be absolutely accurate, but we just want to make sure it's not going to be in the seam. There you go. So it's got at least 1/2 inch there around for the seam. I'm going to do the same thing on this side, and that's this step done. Step 8 is the exterior assembly. So you're going to need your exterior gusset and your 2 main panels. And the first thing we need to do, if you haven't already, is we need to mark the centers on everything. So on my gusset, I'm going to fold it in half to find the center. And then what I'm going to do is do a tiny snip there, which is going to leave me with like a little V shape marking the center. So I know my centers are already marked from earlier, but I like to do them again just in case, you know, any of my seam allowances are slightly different and the finished gusset center is slightly off. So we'll start with fitting the gusset to the front panel, because the second panel that you fit is going to be slightly more difficult. So we want to do the front panel first. Grab some clips, and first of all, we're going to match the center on the gusset to the center on the main panel. Next, you want to clip the tops together. So you just want to line those up and clip together. So to get this gusset to fit, we need to snip into it. Just small snips where it's going to be going around the curve. So you need to make sure that they're no bigger than about 1/4 of an inch, because you don't want them coming out of your seam allowance. Now you can clip the rest into place, and as you're going around the curves, where the snips are, it will just kind of ease around those curves because the gusset is smaller due to the seam allowance we're using. So you can see how these, where we snipped, it's kind of spreading around the curve. Okay, we're just going to do the same thing with this side of the gusset. Now that's clipped in place, I'm going to sew around the whole thing with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. I'm going to do it with the gusset side up because that feels slightly easier. Then I'm going to sew a second row of stitching just inside the seam allowance from the first, but I'm going to start and stop about 1 inch down from the top. What that will do is reinforce the seams, but it means that I can still press the seam open at the top. As you're sewing the gusset on, be careful not to sew through the stabilizer. So if it's not fused in place yet, you can just kind of push it out the way as you're sewing. once that's sewn on, we're going to repeat the process with the other side of the panel. So you're just going to match up those centre marks first of all and clip them together. And now we're going to sew that on with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then we're going to do a second row of stitching just within the seam allowance to reinforce it. Sewing this panel on is going to be slightly harder than the first one. If you want to make it easier for yourself, you could hand baste the seam in place before starting, or some people prefer to use staples to clip it in place. But if you do that, just make sure you don't hit the staples with your needle, and you'll need to remove them afterwards. Now that's sewn on, what we're going to do is we're just going to push these seams, like press them so that they're open, and I'm going to baste them in place on the machine. This means that when we're top stitching later, they will definitely stay open, which will make things easier and less bulky. So I'm going to do this with all 4 of the seams on the top. Step 9 is final construction. So you've got your exterior. I don't recommend turning it out right side out to check, because you're going to have to turn it back again. We need it to be this way around. Normally you can tell if you've got any puckers or anything that you need to fix, because you can see them from this side, but you can also just have a really good look inside and check everything out. But just bear in mind, if you turn this out to have a look at it, then you're going to have to turn it back in again. So mine's still this way out. My lining is like this. Now I need to open the zips, both zips on my lining fully, and then I need to turn it right side out. Okay, so we're going to place the lining inside. To be honest, you can do this whichever way around you want. I think I'm going to have mine with the zip pocket on the exterior that doesn't have a pocket. So shove your lining in, make sure your zip's all the way in, and then fold your handles down so that they're between the exterior and the lining. And we need to match up these seams, so match them up on the exterior and the lining and clip together. So get these little dipped side sections matched up and just clip them in place. And then you want to clip the rest of this top seam together. So we're now going to sew this top edge with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. It's a bit awkward, and if you have a domestic machine, this is going to be way easier, because you can take the arm off your machine and you can just, sew it around the arm. If you have a cylinder arm sewing machine, same thing. Because I'm using a flatbed one for this tutorial, I'm going to show you how I sew it from the inside. But what I'm going to do, I find it a little bit tough getting the first seam absolutely perfect. So I'm going to sew it with a 1/4 inch seam allowance first. That will secure everything in place. Then I can take all my clips off, and then I'm going to sew the 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. This will also mean that I've got 2 seams to reinforce the stitching, so that's helpful too. When you're sewing this, watch out for the stabilizer, particularly the Gusset stabilizer. If you haven't fused it in place like mine isn't, then just kind of fold it down out of the way, because you don't want to be sewing through that right now. Okay, so I haven't actually sewn the 3/8 yet because I'm working on a new machine and I'm really not getting to grips with the tension yet. So what I want to do is check my tension before I sew the actual seam. So what I'm just going to do is just push this out, and you can probably see that my stitches are kind of loose here and that they're visible. So that means my tension is not doing well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play around with my tension for a bit on some practice pieces, get it perfected, and then I'm going to sew the 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. So that's not the easiest thing to do with all vinyl. It's definitely a lot easier using cotton and canvas. So if you're making your first one and you're new to bags and that sort of thing, I would definitely recommend cotton or canvas. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn the bag out. So we're going to pull it out through this pocket. It's actually quite a big pocket, so don't panic. It's not going to be as hard as you think. I have done an all vinyl and Peltex one and that came out okay, so you will be able to fit. You just need to take your time. Now push your lining in. Okay, and remember that all of this is part of your lining, so we also need to push that in. So this is going to be our top seam. What you can do is reach in through the pocket and you can like roll this seam out so that it's nice and flat like that. Add some clips and just do that around the whole of the edge so that you've got a nice neat finish. So there you go, all clipped together and ready to sew. This is the point where I put in a fresh needle, just, you know, to make sure that my top stitching looks as neat as possible. Because I'm on a flatbed machine, I'm going to top stitch it from the inside, which is a little bit harder to do. And if you're doing that, just make absolutely sure that these are lined up properly, because if your seams are kind of like slightly wonky, then you're following the lining seam and it's going to make your top stitching look a bit weird. If you're on a domestic, you can just take the arm off and sew it around the arm, much simpler. But for this, I'm going to use my white thread so that it's matching, and then if it's not perfect, no one will know. Okay, not gonna lie to you, that was not easy. Top stitching and all vinyl bags, just a lot harder. So the next thing we're gonna do, if you want an extra firm base, so you can kind of check how firm your base is and decide how you want it. If you want it extra firm, you can cut an extra piece. So the measurements are in the pattern and on page 22 of the pattern. What I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna slip it through the pocket and I'm gonna place it in there. I'm going to make sure that is nice and centered, that it's even on each side, and then I'm going to use some fabric glue to fix it into place. Once the extra base piece is secured in place, there's an optional step. Now, I love doing this, but this is, you know, totally up to you. What I like to do is put some fabric glue in the bag between the lining and exterior gussets, and it's going to mean that my lining just sits really neatly inside. So don't use, you know, a ton of glue, but I just go up the side of the gusset a bit as well. And I try to get my zip pocket out of the way and push the lining gusset down. Make sure it's sitting flush on both sides before your glue dries. So I just kind of reach in with my hands, make sure that the seam of the lining is matching the seam of the exterior. Okay, I'm happy that my gusset is sitting neatly. So now that that's dried, what I'm going to do is close up the pocket, because this is going to be the last thing that we need to do except for the handle rivets. So grab some clips, make sure that those edges that you folded are meeting up. And then I'm just going to sew this closed with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. If you've glued your gusset like I have, just be careful that you're not pulling the lining out as you do this. Now you can pop that pocket back in. It's not going to be a perfectly neat pocket because you'll be able to see that seam, but it's inside the pocket, so it doesn't really matter. Okay, so the next step that we need to do, the very last thing, is to fit some rivets. And what we want to do is fit the rivets through here so that they're going through the inside as well. So I've got this handy little rivet template that I'm going to use. And I'm going to measure down. It's got the measurement in the pattern, but I think it's something like 3/4 of an inch. So I am going to place my mat. I've got a tiny little cutting mat. I'm going to place that underneath. Make sure that everything is sitting straight, and then just punch that hole. Right, I'm going to use my long post rivets for this. So I'll take that over to my hand press and set those rivets, and I'll do the same thing on the other side of the bag. And then we're done. So there it is. I've attached my crossbody strap and it's all done. So I'm pretty happy with how that turned out. The tension issues were a little bit stressful, but hey, that's just part of having a new machine and getting used to it. I think the vinyl looks pretty amazing. I would never have been able to sew that on my normal domestic machine, I don't think. My domestic never used to be able to handle vinyl, so this was a really nice change for me. There you go. That's the zip top closure, and the lining. It was a bit of a bold choice going with pink polka dot, but I think it looks good. So thank you for joining me for this video tutorial. If you want to hear about new patterns, new videos, and if you want weekly bag making tips, you can sign up to our mailing list. I will put the link in the video description, and I'll see you soon on my next video. Thanks for joining me. Bye.